So this is From Maine with Love, an Allagash Brewing podcast where we talk about beer, our community here in Maine, and things that generally make us happy. Liz,
Yeah. Talking about wild beers.
Talking about wild beers.
I love wild beers. They're some of my very favorite.
Yeah. And if you don't even know what wild means, this is the episode for you. We dive deep into what makes a wild beer wild, what makes it different from another beer, what makes it different from between wild and sour, the sort of bacteria you'll find in a wild beer. Not bad, just the sort of thing that gives it its flavor, fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you don't need to know about what's happening. You can just come onto our tasting room, ask us about it, come to the cellars.
Yeah.
We've got plenty to share with you.
Yeah.
And I think, if there's a lot of people out there that say they don't like beer, and I would say give this a try.
Yeah, this is the beer for those people who think they don't like beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we have two experts here with us, helping us talk all about it. It's Jason, our brewmaster, and Zach, our quality program manager, two people who know quite a bit more. They know more about beer than they've forgotten more about beer than I've ever known. That's what I was looking for. That's the phrase.
It's true.
Yeah. So yeah, if you want to learn about wild beer and what it even is, what it's all about, and even some of the in-depth stuff behind the production of it and how you make sure it's all tasting great, this is the episode for you.
Yeah, tune in.
I'm joined here by Liz Wilson.
Hello.
Hi, Liz.
Hey.
Jason Perkins, our brewmaster.
Hello.
And Zach Bodah, our quality program manager.
Hey there.
Thank you for coming because we're here to talk about wild beer.
Yeah.
Wild beer. What is it? What makes it wild? How does it taste? It's going to be a good one. And so before we get to beer, though, got to do some good secret questions. So, Zach, we're going to start with you. What is the most effective play in Pee Wee football?
Most effective play in Pee Wee football.
Like, what would you use if you were like, we're going to win this game? Is there a play?
Well, what is Pee Wee? I'm trying to think what age group
that
might be.
What do you normally coach, though?
It depends on how old my kid is at the time.
Let's say like 9-year-olds.
9-year-olds, that would be jet sweep.
Jet sweep?
Yeah.
Oh.
Hand the ball to the fast kid and let him run around.
I knew there was going to be an answer. That's good. How about if they're like 12? Does it change?
Yeah, it changes. They can throw the ball a little bit at 12.
Okay.
But 9 still feels like highly capable sports. I feel like, I don't know, how old are you in like first or second grade when it's just a hive of children running around the field together?
6, 7, first, second grade, right?
Something like that.
Yeah.
All right, Jason, you're next. What is one of your favorite bars in Ghent, Belgium? It doesn't have to be the best, but I'm kind of like, I'm interested in your own personal sort of vibe.
Man, that's a good one. There's so many good bars in Ghent. I really like Dula Griet and Trollekelder, which are both like near each other. So Trollekelder's like troll cellar, so there's all these creepy trolls everywhere.
Yep.
And Dula Griet's got this thing where if you order a certain beer that comes in a special glass, they don't want you to steal it. You have to give them one of your shoes. And then you put your shoe in this basket, and they put the basket up in the sky. So if you go in there on a busy night, you'll see like a basket full of like 6 or 7 shoes. So that if you really want the glass, you just have to run with one shoe.
Have you seen anyone run?
Yeah, I bet people have done it.
I have not. I think they've got a pretty established program there where no one steals the glasses.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's
They're
good.
like, we don't need security cameras. We're just going to take your shoe.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I did actually get to go to Trollekelder when we were on our trip, and it was it's got I feel like the creepy gnome or the creepy gnomes and trolls do help to like add to the ambiance. It makes it a little more. I think it makes you feel the beer perhaps a bit more because you're seeing all weird trolls and stuff. But good beers.
But then, do you get weird nightmares? You're like, you've had a few. I don't know. I feel like that I would be tripping. I don't know. I
didn't experience it, but you definitely could.
I hesitated a little to answer your question because my favorite bar in Kent is no longer open.
I was wondering. I was thinking.
So I had a good run.
I'm sorry.
Veluccia.
Yeah.
So those who have been there understand.
Need no explanation.
Yes.
Just a normal classic bar.
Yes.
It's
With a
not
lot
like
of
any other
stuff.
bar you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah, a lot of stuff hanging from the ceiling, from as far as I understood. Liz, I wanted to ask you a secret question.
Oh,
It's so
Brett,
secret, I didn't
come
even
on.
write it down.
Yeah, I see that. All right.
I thought of this like 5 minutes ago.
Great.
What is the hardest part you ever played in a theatrical play?
Oh gosh.
Like, it could be most lines. It could have just been like difficulty of singing.
Wasn't hardest, but from an early age, I really wanted a part in this like 5th grade play, and I don't even remember what the play was anymore, but it was like cast for a male, and I just like threw a fit because I felt like I sang it best. And in like 5th grade, I had this like gender crisis where I was like, no, I want this role. And then they're like, no, it's for a boy. And I was like, that's not a good enough answer. And so I don't know,
It's
I
not a
don't
good
know.
enough answer.
no, it wasn't.
not a good
And
enough
I just,
answer.
sometimes I think back on that and like, as a 5th grader, having that sort of gut reaction to things, and it sort of not shaped me, but I feel like it was just a really interesting experience as I started getting into musical theater and choirs and bands and things like that.
That's a formative experience.
It was.
That was a deeper answer than I bet you expected.
Yeah.
100%.
I don't
That's
know.
why I asked these questions, because they're really
We
interesting.
had, I think we had a really wonderful music department. Shout out to Southeastern Connecticut public school system. I think fairly unexpected, but there was a lot of
We'll tag
dedication
them.
and
We'll tag them on Instagram.
yeah, public school, Region 18. Just a lot of respect for the theater, and so there was a lot of dedication in our teachers. Shout out to the music teachers because they put a lot of effort into
Yeah.
rehearsals and things like that. So I always felt pretty well prepared.
Wild beer. We have a couple wild beers in front of us. Shall we pop them open?
Yeah, let's do it.
Sweet.
Yeah, I think wild beer is confusing and wonderful, and I didn't know much. Oh wow!
Good timing.
Tandem.
Let's break open this beer. And
Yeah, it is.
Chat
It is.
about
Yeah, it's.
All
It's.
right.
Yeah. Well, the first question I feel like will help us dive in, and I'd say for Jason or Zach, whoever is feeling like they want to answer it, what does the term "wild" mean?
Yeah, it's a complicated world, so therefore the answer is a little complicated. But I'll first say it's an imperfect term for these type of beers that we'll talk about today. But it's kind of the best one we've managed to come up with. Oftentimes, beers in this realm are referred to as sour beers by a lot of consumers,
Yep.
and we certainly use that descriptor. And this bottle we're drinking here says sour red ale aged with, and which we'll get into in a second. But we don't like to refer to that as a style because we really feel like sour is a descriptor, flavor descriptor, not a beer style.
Yeah.
And there's also just this huge range of sourness that any beverage, food, et cetera, can have. So calling it sour doesn't really tell the whole story. So, we've been trying to use a different term for a long time to capture kind of the really range and creativity of these type of beers, and we've chosen the word wild. So try not to get too technical here, but in a nutshell, during the process of making the beer, we use something instead of or in addition to Saccharomyces, which is the traditional brewer's yeast, basically.
Yep.
So, there's hundreds and hundreds of strains of Saccharomyces that are used in making beer that provide a wide range of flavors. So Saison yeasts and wheat beer yeasts and et cetera, which we use a lot of. These beers that we call wild might use one of those Saccharomyces strains, but something else is also used, some other kind of wild microorganism or instead of. So, for us, that's mostly 3 organisms. Brettanomyces, lactobacillus, and pediococcus are the three most commonly used, organisms that participate and contribute to the beer and the flavor that comes through in the beer.
Gotcha. So let's break those down because we just mentioned them. So lactobacillus, what does lactobacillus do in beer? Zach.
Yeah, great question. Lactobacillus is a tiny lactic acid producing bacteria. And whereas you have yeast, which would consume sugar and produce ethanol and CO2, most lactic acid bacteria, lactobacillus specifically, is going to create ethanol and lactic acid rather than CO2.
And lactic acid is just tartness, basically, or is it more than that?
It's a natural acid that it's the same compound that makes milk sour, same compound that makes a lot of your sour candies sour. So if you're sucking on a Sour Patch Kid, it's lactic acid on the outside of that. Most likely that's giving you that. Think Warheads.
And when you say milk sour, it's like turning milk into yogurt, correct? Not like milk going bad.
Oh, milk going bad.
Oh, milk going bad.
Yeah.
Oh.
So that's not that's a bad descriptor for that in terms of the
If
beer.
you like bad
the
milk.
compound itself in terms of lactic acid, it's the same, but
Interesting.
That's not what makes milk taste bad. It's not
Okay.
lactic acid.
Okay, gotcha. Just the sour aspect. All right, so then that's lactobacillus.
Yeah, and it may do ethanol and lactic acid. It may do lactic acid and CO2. There's different combinations. Different lactobacillus may produce different metabolites.
And then, so like when we say ethanol too, that's alcohol.
Yes,
Okay, that's just the type of alcohol that you will find in beer is ethanol.
correct.
All right, good. And then, all right, so we'll jump to pediococcus, which always sounds like a disease to me, unfortunately. But I always feel like I should my throat's scratchy. But no, it's a good thing when used well. What is pediococcus? What does that do?
It's another family of lactic acid producing bacteria. Both of these things, lacto, pedio, in short, these are things we are trying really, really hard to prevent from contaminating our core lineup of beers. Anything that's not wild, right? So, we have a laboratory, a very robust quality control program, which microbiology is a huge, huge part of. And we are testing our beer from wort leaving the brew house until months and months after the beer has left the brewery in a package to make sure that none of these lactobacillus, pediococcus, beer spoilage organisms are in our beer. And I'm sorry I'm going on a tangent there.
No, it's good. It's interesting.
These are the things we don't want in our regular beer, like 99% of the beer that we make.
Yep.
But it's something that we celebrate in these termed wild beers.
Yeah.
It's another bacterium. It's anaerobic. These bacteria are anaerobic in that they will grow and thrive without the presence of oxygen. So in a bottle of beer or a barrel of beer, there's very, very little oxygen. That's when they're going to take the opportunity to grow and spoil or produce lactic acid.
Yeah, it's fascinating how in one process of brewing, you're really not wanting this bacteria, but in wild beer, which is so, we have it literally separated by buildings here at the brewery. And I'm sure, I don't know how long that's been the case, but now you go into the barrel room and it's, it thrives.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've always had some level of separation between the wild beers and our regular beers and in our regular barrel-aged beers, because, of course, a beer like Curio is a barrel-aged beer, but not what we would call a wild beer. But it's been in a totally separate building for about 12 years now.
How does all of that wild stuff actually get into beer?
Yeah, there's actually a number of different ways that it can happen. Like, Zach kind of alluded to the way that we don't want it to happen, where it's unintentionally or whatever. One thing that's worth noting, I guess, when we're talking about microbes is, one of the things about making beer is that, at least at this point in time, there's no pathogens that have ever been shown to be able to grow in beer. So the microbes that we deal with are not dangerous in the way that some microbes might be in, making milk or
Right.
chicken fingers or whatever. But because of the presence of alcohol, lower pH, and hops, pathogens just can't live in beer. So the number of microbes that can thrive or live in beer is small. The other side of that coin is the ones that can love to.
Right.
And so we have to work really hard to keep it out of the beers we don't want in. And literally every brewery in the world, the most cleanest brewery in the world, which I hope we're one of those, you have those microbes, Brettanomyces, lacto, and pedio somewhere, no matter what. So you have to do everything you can to keep them out. So we do a very good job of that. And then there's, as Zach alluded to, areas where we intentionally add them or intentionally allow them to thrive. So there's really a whole bunch of different ways that we can do it. Probably the simplest way, the beer we're drinking now, this beer starts, the base beer for this beer is, we're drinking a beer called Once Upon an Orchard, which is actually a series of beers.
Yeah.
This particular one is a sour red ale aged with blueberries, raspberries, and vanilla bean. Yeah. So the beer starts as a fairly nondescript red ale. It ferments normally with a normal Saccharomyces strain. And if you had it at that point, it would be fine, but fairly uninteresting red ale. It then gets sent over to our wild beer land and ages in a foeder, which is a very large oak tank. And we add lactobacillus and pediococcus to it. And so we're actually adding our culture. We have our culture kind of going all the time in a little tank called a minion tank.
Yeah.
So we'll add that to it. So that's it's like a culture that we've created and nurtured for a very long time, and that we can add to beer. And when it gets added to the beer, with time, it'll produce lactic acid and turn again, relatively nondescript red ale into a tart red ale. And then in that case, we use that base beer to age on fruit. So that's one way that the microbes can be added. We can also use pre-existing kind of inoculated beer, so beer that already has that culture in it. We can add some of that to it. That's another very old technique for making these kind of beers.
Sure.
We can add fresh. We use a lot of fresh fruit. Fresh fruit is always covered in some level of these microbes. That's another way. And then finally, which I assume we'll talk in more detail about, is our spontaneous beers, which is a whole different process for adding, and I'm doing air quotes for those of you who can't see me, adding the microbes to the beer.
Yeah. Is part of the reason why we use the term wild because some of these exist in nature, like some of these bacteria just kind of exist, or where is the origin of kind of wild?
I don't know where the origin of, I'm not going to pretend we were the first ones to use it to describe the beers we make. We've embraced it fully, for sure. Totally. I mean, it's like any word. It's just a word. I mean, it's a word that is,
words
like I said,
meaning, Jason.
It's an imperfect description for the kind of beers we make, but it's like the best we've come up with so far. We really like the broadness of it. But I guess to answer the question more directly, yes, lactobacillus, pediococcus, and Brettanomyces are all organisms that live in our environment. But so does yeast. I mean, totally. Not to go down a rabbit hole, but clean yeast. That all came from somewhere. It's not like it was manufactured in a lab. Like it was a wild yeast at some point, and it got it's like domesticated.
Got domesticated.
Yeah. It's a feral yeast.
Yeah. I feel like the term wild beer is just the brewer admitting some kind of lack of control in the process.
Sure. Yeah.
Where everything is so structured when you're producing an Allagash White or an IPA. These tame beers, as we refer to them mostly. But you throw it in a barrel, you lose some control. You add a culture of bacteria. You're not telling that bacteria how sour to make the beer.
Yeah.
You're kind of at the will of the culture itself.
Totally.
Look at fruit. If you're throwing fruit in, you don't know exactly what's on that fruit. You don't have control over the bugs coming in on that.
At the whim of nature.
Bugs
that's a better answer than mine.
But bugs as bacteria.
We'll just cut your answer entirely, Jason. Don't worry. I have two kind of follow-up thoughts from that. One is we've never actually defined Brettanomyces. So could one of you define what Brettanomyces is for us?
Sure. Brettanomyces is another genus of yeast. So single cellular yeast, but instead of Saccharomyces, it's Brettanomyces. It is less commonly used in brewing. However, with traditional Belgian brewing, it's been celebrated. It is mostly an enemy to the wine industry. If you talk to people who know their wine, or maybe some vintners or winemakers, they don't look kindly at Brett, and at least that's
except for
my
some
understanding.
certain select, natural winemakers
Right,
might
the newer
embrace it, but
new guard.
and most winemakers really think it's the enemy.
And it produces, again, different metabolites than Saccharomyces or brewer's yeast. It's more assertive a lot of times. There's as many species of Brett as there are species of Saccharomyces. So you can't just blanket Brettanomyces as these defining characteristics. But a lot of the time it's a slower ferment. They can produce a little bit more of acetic acid than a Saccharomyces, but they usually have more phenolic wild characters. I'm thinking just generically, how would we term those?
So like acetic's like vinegary, right?
Yeah.
And then phenolic is more like spices, we normally say, right?
Yeah,
like clovey.
spices, or you can go as far as Band-Aid. You
Band-Aid,
can
that's
go
right, yeah.
to horse blanket, but you can also go tropical fruit and pineapple, and it's a pretty wide range of characters.
Yeah. Probably one of the most well-known beers with Brettanomyces in it would be Orval, I'd say, right? Or more widely available, perhaps.
Totally.
Yeah. Which is a delicious beer, by the way.
One of the best in the world.
Yeah. Amazing beer.
How do you track our wild beers in their, like, okay, we've either added or blended or, stuck something out in our cool ship, which we'll talk about. But then how do you, I know, just monitoring, tasting, and how quickly do you know if something is headed in the right direction versus like, oof, they've taken over?
Yeah, I mean, we do have good record keeping in general for, like we do for any beer, whether it's in a barrel or it's in a tank. Like we know what went in there and what fruit went in there and that kind of thing. So that part's relatively simple. But in terms of like monitoring it through the process, it's almost exclusively sensory based. There's some analytics we can do in terms of density or sugar content and pH and stuff like that. But in the end, it's how it smells and tastes that matters.
Yeah.
So you basically just monitor by tasting barrels throughout the process. And for certain beers that we've made before, like our cool ship beers we make every year, and we've been making them since 2007, there's a little bit of like an understanding of the cycle of it. So, well, for example, I won't even basically try those beers until a year, roughly. I mean, I've kind of found there's not really any reason to for the most part. Whereas if it's a newer beer, we're trying something new, which we do a ton of like super small scale fooling around stuff.
Yeah.
Then we might be checking a little bit more often and checking in on how it's smelling and tasting.
Right. I think that goes into the other question that I had in my mind of like, how do you wrangle control back if these beers are somewhat kind of doing their own thing? What are the brewers, what's the toolkit that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it like simply say, like with beers like this, and Zach's right, like you surrender some control, but it's not like you surrender at all, right? Like, and so I think about it like we control as much as we can control, and then blending kind of gets us out of that as the final quality control piece, which of course we'll talk about. But in terms of control, like we still are, the room that these barrels sit in is temperature controlled. Year round. That's a piece that we haven't surrendered. The quality of the barrels is something we take very seriously and make sure the barrels are in good shape when we use them for the first time. If we have barrels that aren't producing the way we want, they go away. With the cool ship program, we only brew certain times of the year, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not like there's no control, but you're surrendering a bunch of it. And sometimes you'll have completely unexplained two exactly the same barrels from the same batch of beer sitting side by side next to each other on a rack, and one tastes great, one tastes awful. You just don't know sometimes. And so blending and dumping barrels that don't taste great are like, that's the quality, that's like the final quality control piece for beers like this.
Yeah. And by blending, you're taking multiple different barrels and putting them together in different amounts to get the desired flavor profile.
Correct.
And like you had a really, I think, I don't remember even when you said this could have been on a previous podcast, but it's like you can't blend away bad right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, if a barrel has a certain off flavor that we're not excited about, like it's just, you can only dilute it down so far before it's not worth it. So, we people always ask me how much we dump, and I don't have a great handle on that exactly, but it's significantly more loss, if you will, than any other process we do here, and it has to be something you kind of accept going into it. Like, we're going to probably dump 20 to 30% of the beer we make in that room. And if we don't, the overall blend's not going to taste good. So it's just kind of part of it.
That just like builds into the kind of like the romance of these beers for me. It's like it's so hard to communicate all of that on the label when you have like 45 words and you also need to talk about the ingredients and whatever else. And so it's like, so we have our cellars experience. We've talked about that before. Like, I feel like that's the perfect venue to enjoy these beers, where you get to talk about them, hear about them, see where they're being aged for years at a time. And like, there's a lot that goes into them, and they're really thoughtful. So yeah, it's fun to kind of.
It's really interesting because I feel like a lot of times you talk to people and sometimes you hear, oh, I don't care for beer. And then you give them a Cool Ship or, one of the Once Upon an Orchard series. And it sort of is a very different experience than, I guess, what you envision in drinking a typical beer. And I don't know, is there like, yes, they taste very different, but I don't know if there's like an underlying answer as to why that is. But I've had that conversation, and I'm sure it happens in the tasting room all the time, where, a guest will say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't care for beer. And one of our tasting room staff says, oh, try this. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's so different than anything I've ever had. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's made, the beer's made with similar ingredients as standard beer, right? It's malted barley and it's wheat and hops, of course, and it's carbonated. But that's kind of where it ends. Yeah, beyond that, and a lot of these beers are way more similar to wine than they are to beer in the flavor profile, aroma, characteristics, etc.
Totally. So I don't want to just gloss over it, because I actually think we're going to have like an entire episode about Cool Ship stuff. Like, I feel like that is just such a dense subject for us to go over. But if we could do a high level, because we've talked about it a couple times, like, what is the Cool Ship brewing process? Like, what sets that apart from what we just talked about of you brew a beer, you ferment it with Saccharomyces, and then you age it in one of these fooders with fruit potentially? What makes a Cool Ship beer different?
Our Cool Ship program, we started in 2007, and it was basically a project, which we called it to start with, like to basically see if we can make what is referred to as spontaneously fermented beer in Greater Portland. At the time, kind of the conventional wisdom was you could only make a beer in this style. So in the lambic style, we don't call our beer lambic, but that is after. The process is modeled after lambic, which is a traditional, very old style, originating out of Belgium, Brussels, Belgium region specifically. And at the time, 2007, the conventional wisdom was you could kind of only make these beers in this like magical radius around Brussels. And we talked to some of the lambic blenders and brewers over there. They didn't necessarily feel that way, so we basically said let's give it a go and try it. And without getting too deep into the weeds, technically speaking, like, it's basically the brewing process is similar to a normal traditional beer. There's some nuance difference to it in terms of the ingredients you use in the process, but in the end, instead of taking what's called wort, the hot liquid that comes out of the brew house before it gets fermented, instead of cooling it down in a closed system like a heat exchanger, which is 99.99% of the beer made in the world is done that way, you send it fully hot, so boiling temperatures, to a vessel that is referred to as a Cool Ship. So it looks like a big brownie pan, basically, this big shallow vessel. It goes into that, which is in a dedicated room that we have here, dedicated building, small building actually, and it stays in that room overnight. And in the process of being in this open top vessel, it cools down, hence the name Cool Ship, but also gets inoculated with natural microflora in the area. So wild yeast, Brettanomyces, a whole bunch of different things, and then it ferments. So that's where the term spontaneous comes from, which is, again, an imperfect term, but you get the idea. Natural fermentation is probably a little bit of a better word, but And then it goes from there into oak barrels and lives in those oak barrels for 1 to 3 years before it's finished. So it's very long, very traditional, very slow fermentation process.
So I once referred to it as the like sourdough method of making beer. I think with Patrick around, and Patrick was like, "That's not really right." I was like, "What is it? Like kind of close, maybe?"
Bringing you back down, Brent.
Yeah, well, I only know so much. I don't know much of the science.
Yeah. And is the 1 to 3 year it's like literally, I guess for coolship, as in coolship resurgam, like we've kind of dialed that in. We know after a year, like you'll check that and see how it's going. We'll blend that in for consistency.
Yeah,
And
so
then,
1, 2, and the resurgam is unfruited, because we do have several versions of beer with the same base beer. That is an unfruited version. It's our kind of shout out or interpretation of a goose, which is a traditional lambic style beer. And it is 1, 2, and 3 year old. And the amount of each one of those changes a little bit each year. Again, sensory based, but we always need a little bit of 1 year in there for yeast and a little bit of residual sugar, because we don't add any yeast for the bottle re-fermentation process. So we need young yeast basically, because 2 and 3 year old sitting in a barrel for that long, the yeast that's in there is not so happy anymore.
Yeah.
So the 1 year old is really just there to help re-ferment the bottle. And then the 2 year old has some acidity built up, but not quite as complex. And the 3 year is like, has the same acid as 2 years, the same tartness as a 2 year old, but a little bit more depth and roundness to it.
How has our approach to blending those beers together changed over the years? Have we because I just remember when we did the original, we did a Wild Friendship blend with 3 different, we've done this blend where we send beer around, and it was with Russian River and Cantillon in Belgium. And I remember hearing you, Jason, talk about how perhaps we did a slightly more assertive blend than we would have otherwise, putting perhaps some more of the more expressive beer, the more sort of Brettanomyces, like that sort of stuff in there. Whereas maybe now we do a slightly more nuanced blend. Has our philosophy around the flavor of those beer changed over the years, or not really?
I wouldn't say the philosophy has changed a lot. I think the biggest change of all from the early years is the amount of options or stock, if you will, to choose from. So in the first, so we started in 2007, brewed a couple batches, 2008, a couple batches. So you figure we're blending for the first time in 2010, and we had, it's either that barrel or that barrel, whereas now we've been brewing for years, and we have the stock, so we just have more choices. So that just inevitably makes the beer a little bit more rounded. That said, I've recently had the 2011 Coolship Resurgam, and it's still so
that's good.
why do these, and I feel like people hang on to these beers more so than other beers, and they do age pretty well. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, a lot of it comes down to preference. Definitely. There is some subjectivity, but the majority of these beers have a lower pH, which if you think about if you're canning tomatoes or you're making sauerkraut and these things last for a long time, these beers last longer. They're less prone to rapid aging because they have a lower pH level. And a lot of times the aging has already been done for you. Jason's talking about 2-3 year old beer.
Right.
A lot of those oxidative characteristics that could happen with beer aging have kind of already happened. And they could be masked by other characteristics in the beer.
Yeah, there's a Rodenbach, which is a very amazing historical brewery in Belgium, still in existence, and a huge amount of barrels and a ton of respect for what they do there. Rudy's their longtime brewmaster there, and he describes it as preservation through acidification, which I would just like that simplicity of that term. And that is just, there's something about the tartness of these beers and the presence of Brettanomyces and wild yeast in the package that really protects it from the typical effects of oxygen and aging over time.
This is so outside of the realm of what people normally consider beer. It's just fun to talk about and sip, and I've had half of a 10-ounce glass in this entire time, and it's it's great. It's just nice to think about.
Yeah, and if you're listening and you've never had These beers are, I've always wondered. Come ask our tasting room staff.
Yeah.
They'll give you a taste and be happy to share with you all about it, because I'm sure it can be intimidating to just even understand what this is. So
And we usually have something on the tasting
Yeah.
room, at least something that's in this, if not several,
Yeah.
that are in the realm of what we call wild beers. But yeah, tasting room staff, super knowledgeable. They can walk you through them all, or do the seller's experience.
Or do the
which is
seller's.
amazing.
Yeah, that's a great place to do it. Also, I think just on top of all this, like while we say these are expressive, there's a lot of character going on. They're really good. Like they're really tasty. You're not going to have to work too hard to be like enjoying these beers. They're just really tasty, balanced beers. So
yeah.
The balance is key.
Balance is key.
It's I know we talked about categorizing these beers as sour beers, and it's really not always true. There's usually a level of tartness for sure.
Yeah.
But to say that they're sour is kind of one dimensional, right?
Yeah,
and
it's
it's
hard.
really easy to make a.
Can you think
a
of an
beer super
example
sour.
that is a wild beer that's not sour?
Depends on how you define sour, right? Like to some degree, all beer is sour because it's more, it's 4.2, 4.3 pH, and water is 6 or 7, right? But I mean, I think like something like Interlude or Confluence are both beers that come to mind for me, which are Brettanomyces focused beers. We would call those both wild, and Confluence especially is very similar acidity level as Allagash White, and Interlude's a little bit lower. So that's, again, like I said earlier, and to reinforce what Zach said, like that there's just such a spectrum of sourness that can express itself in these beers. And so just calling it sour alone just kind of doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah. And I feel like there's an interesting, I feel like in beer trends, there's a lot of talk about sour beers. And, there's kettle sour, which is not what we've been talking about at all. So I guess in like a very quick explainer, what is the difference between our, wild beers that are sour and kettle sour beers?
One word would be finesse, I think, honestly. Kettle sours are produced with lactic acid producing bacteria, right? It's the same thing that is producing a lot of the acid in these wild beers that we're producing here. But like I said, you can do it short and quick, or you can let the process happen naturally over time. And it's really easy to make a beer sour in the kettle by just letting the wort sit overnight, and you throw some bacteria in there. That lactobacillus grows very fast, produces acid very well. It's very good at what it does. And now you have super sour wort, and knock it out, stick it in the fermenter, and pitch some yeast. Not all kettle sours lack finesse, I would say, but you start off with sour wort, you're asking a lot of your brewer's yeast, your Saccharomyces. A lot of times they aren't happy fermenting at 3.2 pH.
Yeah.
Starting that process at 3.2 is it's a brutal task.
Our wild beers, that's a huge experimentation part of our brewery. Are there ingredients that you are excited about trying out for some of these wild beers that are coming up on the docket here? I mean, we use a lot of different fruits.
We haven't really talked about the fruit. I mean,
I know
the
it's such
fruit
a
is
huge part of
huge.
it.
Such a star of the show with these beers, and we use almost exclusively Maine grown fruit,
right?
And all freshly harvested, and so we're getting fruit from a farmer, and it's going in the beer that day. So it's right, and anyone who's eats fruit from a grocery store and then goes to the farm and does pick your own, like they're night and day, like they're just totally different. So the farmer can pick for us when it's like falling off the tree or the bush at its height of its ripeness, which probably would like compost or rot in like a day. That's why you can't get it that way in the grocery store. So we get the most fresh, delicious fruit you can imagine, and we add a ton of it to beer and let that really, the acidity is the acid beer, the sour beer is the base for it, and the fruit really gets to shine. So me working with Maine fruit, I don't want to say it's limiting, but there's only a handful here in our cold climate that can grow. So it's raspberries, blueberries, cherries, peaches, strawberries. So still a pretty amazing range of
Those are
awesome
some good fruits.
They're
We
good
just
fruits.
started working in the last year or two with honeyberries, also referred to as hascup. Has a bunch of different names, and just really, I'm totally in love with this fruit. It's nothing like it's like familiar, the flavors it produces, but it's also unique at the same time. It's got a little cherry, it's got a little date, it's got a little blueberry, it's got all these various components to it, and so we've made a couple really fun beers with that fruit.
And we have a Once Upon an Orchard with honeyberries too, right? That's
Yeah,
another-
coming out
We do.
later this year.
coming out.
Yeah.
And like, so in this beer we're tasting, we have raspberries, we have blueberries, we also have vanilla. And I feel like, Zach, you talked earlier about balance, and I feel like how we treated that vanilla, I think, is very Allagash-y.
This vanilla is, talking about fun new things for Allagash wild beers. Brand new. We've never used
And
vanilla.
what form
Yeah.
is the vanilla in
Bean.
bean?
Scraped
Full
a bean.
bean.
Yeah.
Cut in half bean.
Madagascar vanilla beans, like cut open and scraped.
Wow. That's awesome. So what, like, I mean, because this beer is not vanilla-y.
No.
What do you think it adds to the beer? What sort of a component are you finding?
Yeah, it's a good question. Really, it just adds another layer of depth. I don't think if you didn't tell me there was vanilla in there, I wouldn't be like, oh, this is a nice vanilla beer. I think you could confuse it for barrel character.
Yeah.
And a lot of times with a fresh barrel, you're getting some vanilla in there. It is a little different, and it works really nicely with the raspberry in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say I often not always. There's some cases, obviously, if we want to make a raspberry beer, we want you to be able to taste,
Totally.
look at it, smell it. But in the case of spices especially, I really like it when it's at this level where if you just give me the glass of beer and I drink it, I'm like, man, that's familiar. It's really cool. But I can't put my finger on it. And then the person's like, vanilla. And you're like, yes. Then you've hit that level perfectly in my mind
Yeah.
with a lot of these things. And that's what we were shooting for here. And we did a bunch of really fun trials with different vanilla bean types. And you can not surprised, just like fruit or anything else. It's a pretty wide range in how it contributes to the beer. And we added it after the fruit and aging portion and kind of like not to get into the process, but like an infusion method where we could slowly add it and get it right where we wanted it and stop. And so
awesome.
I'm super happy with how it turned out.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Oh, it's super tasty. It's a great beer. If you want to go and find Once Upon an Orchard, you'll be able to find it through our website. You go to allagash.com/locator. We have a beer locator. You can try to find some bottles near you, or you can just come to Allagash. Come to visit us in Portland, Maine. We'll definitely have some bottles here for the near future, I imagine. We only can make a finite amount as we only get so much fruit. But thank you both. That was awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's super fun.
I know. Some of my favorite.
Just wait for the honeyberry.
Oh. Wait for that honeyberry. Well, cheers.
Cheers.
See ya. This has been an Allagash Brewing production. And if you have something you want us to talk about on the show, shoot us a message at podcast@allagash.com.